Hello, this will be my second episode. Um, it'll be about conflation and using it as a deceptive tool. There's been a lot of arguments I'm seeing just in online, social media. I see it in the news. Uh, a big divide between gender, politics, religion, just anything that has an argument will use conflation. And then they'll use it to convince you one way or the other to join their side or just to disprove your argument. Um, let's see. This is actually the second time I tried recording this. The first time I've had some issues, tech issues, but let's see. So when you debate, there are rules of engagement. Um, anyone that has done debate probably knows this, but in case you don't, typically you want to have some sort of basis of agreement, kind of like ground rules. Have a theme, you stick to that, or you have kind of like a contract. You use terms and words that are defined that you agree upon the definition of. More so, there's no confusion about the topic of debate and the words used for your point or their point. When you do this, you want to do it in good faith. So you want to start with the topic and how the opposing side defines that topic versus how you define it. That way, you can bring the argument to them and allow them to present their side to you. You don't want to do it in bad faith where you have the, let's say, the official or objective definition of the topic, whilst they have an incorrect definition, such that you both go forward in the argument, in the debate, and you catch them so that the whole time they're talking about something completely different, so that on that technicality it disproves their entire point. Because if you are correct and if you win and you're right, the debate is fruitless because they'll come away even more dug into the ground that your whole point was pedantic instead of convincing. And that brings me to the word pedantic. When people use semantic and pedantic in any of the sort, they use it as a defense mechanism to dismiss or ignore the fact that they're wrong. Usually because they don't know the difference between what they thought the term meant versus what it actually meant. Because to them, any synonym is equal. which is not the case. Not all synonyms are interchangeable. So that I see is a very, very liberal use of linguistics. And I'm not trying to be political, but that does seem to be the case. Words don't stick to the definitions, and this unfortunately over the years has mutated how words work. Irregardless and regardless mean the same thing now, literally and figuratively, even though they're complete opposites, mean the same thing now. Uh, yeah, it's let's you gotta agree on what words mean before engaging in a debate. Um, so when you're debating somebody, you want to make sure you call out any deceptive practices, whether they are lying or deceiving you or themselves. It's almost better that they're deceiving themselves, because if you clarify that for them, then there'll be some modicum of gratitude. They'll say, they might thank you, or uh, it might even strengthen their argument, which is kind of like an olive branch. Because if you say it like, I think this is what you meant when you said this, it opens up the dialogue for further discussion and debate. And should they realize they're wrong, because you've done this for them, um, they might come to appreciate and understand your point. So it's a um, good faith practice to use. Let's see. So, how to spot deceptive practices or bad faith practices? So when people use deception to, in terms of conflation, or in terms of skirting the truth, that's how you basically spot the lie, because lies are always compared to the truth. They're not really, they can't stand on their own 2 feet, so to speak. So in court, they have you uh, swear an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So, in comparison to those three things, you can take uh, deceptions from that, and there will be, let's say, um, the whole truth. So, the truth is basically, think of the truth as um, if you compare the truth to a fact is a cross section of the truth, and subject dependent. Uh, Facts are subjective. Facts are a cross section. The truth is uh, endless, perpetual. It is ever factual and objective. So, in order for you to be able to spot a lie from the truth, a lie is a cross section, not ever perpetual. So, the opposite of a lie is a fact, not the truth. That is a type of conflation. So all you have to do to spot this is the lie consistent to the point where you can trace it back or predict forward with it. If there's no more, if there are no multiple points on that line, then it's a lie. Um, or it's a story, but a story ends and it begins. The truth has no beginning and end. So that's a line segment, not a line. Uh, and then the whole truth. The whole truth is, again, a segment. Sorry. The opposite of the whole truth is cut out of context. Deception out of context. So they call that a lie of omission. Excuse me. So a lie of omission is opposite of the whole truth because some people call it context, but context is subjective. What you want is the entire the whatever the technical fact of the matter in its entirety. So let's take, for example, a clip that's cut out of context. You can say a line or sentence, and it would be whatever you say could be snipped down to something offensive and then posted online to get you canceled. And then it's clipped out of context. But the more you add context to it, the more you can reframe it. So that's why you don't want to say it's just context, because context is a narrative. And I say that because you could say, even in context, you want the whole story. Truth doesn't follow a story or a narrative. Truth is objective. So just have the whole paragraph or body of work intact when you quote it or when you are quoted. It's very easy to spot the difference between a body and a line. So, and then the third part of that oath is nothing but the truth. Uh, when you say nothing but the truth, you want to just have the objective information, not your perception or how you how your understanding of that perceived truth. And when you hear my people say this is my truth, that is not you're not gonna go to court and take the stand and tell people your truth. You can tell them your testimony, but that's not what they want. They don't want your truth. They want the truth. So when you say nothing but the truth, they want they don't want you to give your interpretation of how your experience was. So they just want the data. um, so nothing but the truth is the truth without your interpretation. And that part is the hardest part, probably, because it's the part with your bias. Um, and it's very difficult to remove your bias um, when facts are subjective. Okay, and let's go back to uh, the topic here. conflating. So what is conflating? Conflating is I'm gonna have to lean on some of my tech background here. Conflating is when you take two things that are similar enough to the point where you try to use them, you try to get away with using them interchangeably, but they have enough difference that they're not the same, such that this will be easier, I guess, with concrete examples. But let's say in politics, you have the left Democrats and what is in liberalism. These are things that people conflate all the time. And they say they're all the same thing, they're used interchangeably, but they're not. And the same can be said with right wing, conservative, and Republican. They conflate them all the time and use them interchangeably to convince people they're the same. But again, they're not. So it's very easy to prove that. Charlie Kirk, for example, it's obvious he's not whatever they claim he was with the far right whatevers. He's just right of center. There are people just left of center. They're not progressives necessarily. And by conflating these things together, you create false equivalencies. Let's say I'm a conservative Democrat. Well, nowadays you can't be that because of the conflating, all the false equivalencies. What if you're a liberal Republican? Well, you can't be that either because anything far right and a part of that conflated idea must be the same. So that's all I'll touch on politics in a nutshell. At least I'll try not to be offensive or take sides on that. Let's see. I do have my own politics, but that's not going to be the topic for today. So, in programming, conflating can be described as what's known as concatenation. When you concatenate two things, you're bonding them together into a composite. That composite value then is not necessarily equated to, but aliased to the previous value. So let's say you have two values A and B. Then you say you concatenate them into a composite such that A equals AB or B equals AB, but A does not equal B. Well, by the conflated part would be, well, if AB equals A and B, then A must equal B, even though I just told you they're not equal. But the conflated part makes the lie, so to speak. I believe there's a mathematical term that describes this as well. Transitive properties, something like that. But in programming, you have to make it equal, not just equal. So, depending on the language. And that's where I'm coming from when describing conflated ideas. Let's see. One way you could describe this in the vernacular is how people use apples and oranges. Everyone separates via taxonomy. Well, this is apples and oranges, so they're nothing alike. But then you can, by that same aspect, excuse me, you can use the hierarchy of taxonomy to equate. Oh, they're both fruits. So when I talk about apples, I'm talking about fruits. When I'm talking about oranges, I'm also talking about fruits. Therefore, I'll call, whenever you talk about your argument is about apples, I will change that vernacular to fruits, even though my argument is about oranges. Therefore, by changing the verbiage to fruits, even though you're talking about apples, I will be able to conflate information about oranges into poisoning your argument about apples. We could say something like oranges is how we got penicillin, and apples is how we got arsenic. I think that was right. But because they're both fruits, look, we could make the argument that where I say fruit is healthy in large doses, and your argument could be, no, too many apples can cause arsenic poisoning, and I'll say, well, fruit had like that has even rotten fruit like could have benefits like I'll say like penicillin. I'm technically telling a fact, but by conflating apple into fruit, I've told a lie of omission. Kind of, I conflated his apple of fact about arsenic into something categorically uh, inequivalent to his taxonomy, his hierarchical level of taxonomy. It's conflated now. So don't let me or whoever you're arguing with do that until they acknowledge or correct that conflated idea. Do not move on. Just reiterate. Well, I'm talking about apples. You're talking about fruit. I believe in math. There's also the square and rectangle version, where I think a rectangle is a square, but a square is not a rectangle. You can do that as well. If you don't know what I'm talking about, uh, a rectangle, both a rectangle and square fit in the category of quadrilaterals, but a square is defined as four equal sides, while a rectangle is defined as two pairs of parallel sides of any two lengths. So a square does fit the definition of having two pairs of sides of any two lengths. Those lengths just happen to be equal, whereas the rectangle does not fit the definition of a square in that it is not equal on all sides. So that's where that comes from. But calling them both quadrilaterals when you're talking about rectangles and I'm talking about squares is conflating the argument. Okay. If I misspoke, I apologize. I'm just reading, trying to recall and read some of my notes from my previous attempts at this episode. Okay. I'm sure there's other examples. If you can think of any, please leave a comment down below. Um, so, aside from politics and math and um, programming or tech, well, okay. In tech, there is something that's more, I guess, relatable. If you've ever had to be on a phone call with some sort of tech support, let's say your internet's not working, you might have a job or have had a job where you had to act as your office's tech guy, and you've had to be on call for your office where you had to troubleshoot your ISP, your internet service, was not providing. So, in order for your equipment to be serviced, you had to prove over the phone that their equipment being rented out to you was the problem. Otherwise, they'll ask you to, submit a ticket to someone else. I'm sure uh, many have had this issue. I've been on both sides of that, but yeah, the for that the more times than not there'll be a person on the line trying to gaslight you basically into thinking their equipment is not the problem. So I'll give you a example, or for instance, the person on the phone is usually some sort of manufacturer warranty, um, or just some sort of uh, person on the line that has to process um, the ticket or the request that you, the caller, is describing. We'll call that person a processing agent, and she'll assume you're the customer, or perhaps you're the tech slash network engineer. We'll go with the ISP example. So in a corporate environment, you'll have um, a gateway, a DHCP device, and a switch, and then your computer slash nodes. That could be anything. It could be a phone. It could be a computer. It could be a tablet. Um, but those are typically known as layers. So the processing agent might ask you to do some troubleshooting, and between the troubleshooter and the processing agent, you'll have to prove to them that it's their device that's the problem, not your device or your layer. It's but their layer, in order for them to send you a new piece of equipment. This is kind of a tactic that is very commonplace. And what you can do if you're not tech savvy, or if you're not an engineer, or somebody that's specialized in this field, you can just use basic understanding of a language. Um, if you've ever heard somebody say words matter, um, kind of like how I described earlier with how things can be seen as pedantic or semantic. This is why You don't want to depend on those concepts because to delay, a router and a switch are the same thing. They both send the internet to your computer in a very generic way. But they're not. They have completely different functions. Um, so because you may not understand those nuances, it might be this interchangeable, but in reality or in practice, uh, it means the difference between getting the support you need versus not getting support you need. So I often just define pedantic or semantic as um, people that don't care or don't care to understand the difference. Um, at least that seems to be the pattern um, that is used in debate. So back to the example with the processing agent. If they try to ask you something like, how many computers or are you is having this problem, or when did this problem occur? Is it still occurring? They'll ask you some generic, what sounds like helpful questions. Uh, you describe like where your computer is on the network, because what they'll try to do is convince you that there's something between your experience and what their experience is, and it will be the problem will be more closely tied where you're experiencing it than where they're experiencing it. So what you have to do is just close that gap. If their equipment, let's say, is the router or the gateway or the DHCP server, and your equipment is the computer and the switch, they will conflate some of the items so that, let's say, they conflate the switch and the router, even though the switch is your responsibility, and you are trying to access a website or a web service on your computer, and they'll ask you all these questions about what browser are you using. Please clear your cache or your cookies and all that jazz. And then still not working. Uh, you could connect your computer directly to the router, for example, and then it works. Let's say the processing agent might at some point say, well, it sounds like it's a switch issue. As I just want to recap with you, sir or madam, you've connected your computer directly behind the switch, and it worked right after. So we've properly diagnosed this together, proved it's not the computer, so you're not at fault at that point, but the fault is at the switch level. So what he's doing or she's doing right there is conflating the router and the switch, because to you it might be the same. Um, you just know it's not the computer, and because he said something like, "It's not your fault," right there, it you accept that as absolving yourself from that sin. So we're looking at, not my fault. This it sounds like the switch is your fault, so you're gonna replace it, right? Well, he's got you on record that you've admitted it to being the fault of the switch, which is your responsibility. They can just end the call right there. They could just close the ticket, because the router is their responsibility, not the switch. So that's one common way conflating is used in a professional everyday life. Excuse me. Another way I see outside of the tech sphere is maybe in In politics, video games has commonly entered the fray, whether it be for consumer rights, or it could also be, unfortunately, more often than not, the scapegoat of other more serious things like violence, drugs, and sex. Blame video games for everything. Oh, it's a video game, so why won't anyone think of the children? It's always the video games. They'll take they'll take a shooting or an assassination attempt or a mass shooting, for example, and blame video games for it. And nothing is a monolith, but they'll put some sort of ban on video games, thinking that yes, there are FPSs, but there's also like Farmville and Tetris. There's Why would they conflate everything into one bucket? So there's very little correlation in proven statistics that correlate video games to real world violence. In fact, there's almost none. Um, every time this is brought up, I think every 10 years or so, 5 to 10 years, it's always shot down because pun not intended. But it's always dismissed as irrelevant because there's no basis of truth behind it. You don't, you don't see you don't see a person playing Farmville, then immediately going outside to get an acre of soil and start planting crops. It doesn't follow any form of repeatable reasoning or logic. You can't take that same line of thought and apply it as a blanket statement like they're trying to do in politics. So I know I said I wouldn't bring politics up, but it is just a pet peeve. You're not going to see somebody play Forza and then immediately jump into a car and start winning, races in heats. There is, I think there was one Nissan event where they did that, but that was specifically advertised and intended for that purpose. So, but it's not gonna happen outside of those specifically intended events. Okay. Let's see where I am. Sorry, just checking my notes. So, ways to combat those conflated things without the expertise. So, back to the um, processing agent. If you don't have that expertise, let's say you don't know how any of those things work. You're not a tech guy. You just happen to answer the phone and get kidnapped into this call. But you need the internet for your office. You can't do your work, so you got to take the call. Well, if they're talking about a switch and a router, you don't care to know the difference. You just want to get this done, but you have to care, because if you don't pay enough attention, it could cost you, uh, God knows how long of work, or loss in profit, loss in uh, everything. So you have to bear and grin it. Well, even though you don't know what a switch does, you know what the word means. Even though you don't know what a router does, you know what that root word means. So, what is the root word of router? A route. Okay. So, a router is one that routes. Okay. What is a switch then? It sounds like a noun form of a verb, right? Something that switches. If you switch from one thing to another, is that not a route? Well, not really. When you look at a map or a list of directions to go from one street to the next, or from A to B in your driving uh, to and from destination and all that, you have a route to follow. You don't switch. You would need GPS or something that would switch routes. And just by that phrase alone, switch routes, that means they're not the same, right? You don't switch us. I mean, you don't route routes. You don't switch. You switch routes. So those are two different things. If that's not enough, you can go behind where maybe the word uh, is analogous to. So if there's a modern device like a switch, what would a predecessor be for that? Maybe you've heard of a switchboard, one in the old movie where they go to a phone booth and talk to the operator, get me the fire department. And they show on the screen an old black and white, let's say, woman behind us, the headset, grabbing some sort of um, cable leading to a lead that goes into a port of some kind, takes it out, puts it into another. I think they call it a bulkhead back then. That's literally the switchboard where they are connecting you to the fire department. Uh, for a route, like I said, there's people that define routes. Now they have operators that will do that, but they'll reroute your call. That doesn't mean they're switching you to another person on that line. It means the route in which your telecommunication device has flowed ended up at the wrong destination. So they're putting you on the correct route or path. You could call this a pathfinder, even. Uh, that person is finding the correct path for you to take to lead you to the correct destination. They're not actually connecting you to that person that you are intended to get, but putting you on the right path. And those are very basic but apt descriptors or descriptions of those devices without going into technical detail. Let's see. And then again, don't let them get away with it. Don't If they start conflating what's your responsibility and their responsibility, beat into the conversation until they use the same words that you use. It's not rude. It's not you being an a-hole. They are trained to use what you are saying. So I'll give you an example. When you pick up the phone and you say, my name is Mrs. Wilkins, for example, and they look up your information and say, I found a Mary Wilkins, or can you verify your full name and phone number before we proceed? And you say your name is excuse me, Mary Wilkins. Guess what? They had to call you Mrs. Wilkins because when you answered the phone, you said, I am Mary, or you can call me Mrs. Wilkins. Even if you identify through this verification process Mary Wilkins, they're trained to not call you Mary Wilkins past the verification step. They have to call you what you ask them to call you. Let's see. And in that same regard, until they acknowledge what you have set forth in that verification process for the processing agent, calling a switch and not a router, you cannot proceed. And also in that same vein, just to scale it to your everyday debate, until the other person you're debating with acknowledges that they are conflating the two terms, whatever they might be, and correct that miscommunication, the argument in the debate cannot proceed. This is a great lesson for people that are running these debates, people that are moderating. You cannot proceed. Or if they refuse to acknowledge or admit that mistake, then they concede the debate, or at least that topic of that debate. Okay. One other thing, when people try to water down a word to the point where it loses all meaning, it's done such that they can inject their own definition into it. I'll give you an example. Privilege, for example, was used originally to describe an honor, the feeling of respect or privilege. I'll use it in context, I guess. Sorry, I don't want to use that word, but within the parameters of its original intent, you might have heard somebody, a master of ceremonies, use it in a way to introduce their speaker or guest. It is my privilege to introduce to you our guest of honor. Please bring your hands together to welcome so and so. That's how privilege was used. Nowadays, it's not at all, not even close. It's used as almost derogatory, actually very insulting. It's used instead of honor. It's used to be minimizing, dismissive, to take away the gravitas of something. I don't want to bring race or any more politics into it, but it is very racist in the way it's used today when it was not used for that purpose. There are many other I brought up before, relevance and irrelevance. Um, Maybe not in this attempt, but literal is not used in its original intent or definition. It's literally not. uh, Regardless and irregardless, I believe I mentioned earlier. Irregardless was never a word until it was, but it means the same thing, which doesn't follow any grammar. So, uh, I'm not trying to be a grammar Nazi, but when you have to agree on terms, you have to agree that they can't be mutated mid sentence. So, let's see. Another example would be murder, kill, assassinate. These words are conflated even though they have completely different consequences. So all you have to do is look in any court case regarding the death of somebody. When they have to look into things like means and motive. Which brings me to means and motive. This is probably the most contentious issue regarding conflated information or misinformation that exists in terms of accusatory debate. So and so murdered so and so in self defense. No, you can't murder somebody in self defense. That it's just self defense that ended in the loss of life. Uh, you can say, well, in war, you're expected to murder your opponent. No, again, that's not what that is. You're expected to kill. You're not expected to murder. In fact, it's almost better to not murder because then you have POWs that you can use as anyway. That's besides the point. Don't allow conflating to occur. And at this point, I'm going to bring it back to the beginning where I talked about being under oath, swearing that oath. When you're in court and you're being asked some sort of yes or no question, or a question in which they try to force you to answer yes or no, but your answer is not a yes or no answer. They'll even tell the judge to get you to cooperate with the lawyer that's examining / cross-examining you. If they don't let you answer in your way, then you can bring up the oath that you're under and that they're asking you to be in contempt and you can you can claim the Fifth Amendment, but that's kind of like a last ditch effort, a last resort, so to speak. Before you get to the point, you can remind the court that the oath you took to take the stand requires you to tell the whole truth. In being forced into a yes or no breaks that part of the oath, and therefore they would be in contempt. You can bring this up. So just remember, all three of those things are required to tell the truth. And not just in court, in any debate. When you recognize they're not telling the whole truth, or they're telling their truth, those things are not the truth. That's where I'll end it for today. Sorry for the brief pauses. I have a dry mouth, parched throat, so hope you enjoyed today's episode on conflation. Thank you.